It was a spectacular win for Robert the Bruce, King of the Scots, over the 2 days of the 23rd and 24th of June 1314. Just like the triumph of Agincourt, which was to follow 100 years later, the Battle of Bannockburn was a win for the underdog, when a formidable army lost to one of significantly fewer numbers. A pivotal battle that would change the course of the First Scottish War of Independence, which ended 14 years later with a victory for the Scots. Today we continue our Day in the Life series and travel back in time to see what life was like for one of Robert the Bruce's soldiers at the Battle of Bannockburn. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Two warring nations. I was 20 years old as the spring became the summer in June 1314. The wars between England and my homeland of Scotland had been going on since 1296, when I was just a boy. My father had told me stories about brave Sir William Wallace at Stirling Bridge and his victorious fight against the English King Edward I, known as Longshanks, the man they called the Hammer of the Scots. And sadly of our defeat the following year at Falkirk, the horrific death of Wallace, and our struggle against the English tyranny ever since. In 1313, King Robert the Bruce had captured every English-held castle except Stirling, and now his demand for that fortress was enough to provoke Edward II to invade my beloved country. And so Edward's army marched north, and King Robert began to plan. As Edward and his men crossed over the border, he found the road to Stirling was blocked. King Robert had chosen his ground well. It was to the south of the castle where the road ran through the hunting park. To the east of us was the Bannock and Pelstream Burns. The land there was soft and marshy. I think the idea was just to defend the castle. Because of the English numbers, there was probably no chance we could win. They had at least 3 times as many men as us, so we dug pits along the road, the forest behind us, which meant that we could retreat easily when the need arose, and we waited. Cut down. There were about 6,000 of us, some on horseback, though not many, perhaps about 500. King Robert divided us into schiltrons. One was commanded by the king's brother Edward Bruce, Earl of Carrick, another by his nephew Sir Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray. The third was led jointly by Sir James Douglas and the young Walter the Steward, and the fourth by King Robert himself. King Robert's friend Angus Og MacDonald, Lord of the Isles, brought many Islesmen and Highlanders down to fight, as well as the Gallowglass warriors from the Norse Gaelic clans of Ireland and Scotland. They were given a place of honour in the king's own schiltron to stay at his side with the men from Argyll and Carrick. My commander was the Black Douglas, good Sir James. The man was a legend and was among the first to stand with brave William Wallace back when Longshanks had his boot firmly planted on our necks. Formidable and ruthless, Douglas was famous for his ambush of English soldiers the year before. When the enemy garrison had attacked his own castle of Douglas, he had hidden away with a small troop until the English soldiers attended church on Palm Sunday. Then he entered the chapel and attacked the unsuspecting worshippers, killing some and taking others prisoner. Sir James took the prisoners down into the cellar of the castle where the stores of food were and piled them all together. He burst open the wine casks and used the wood for fuel after beheading all of the prisoners and throwing their bodies onto the pile. Then he set it all alight before poisoning the wells with salt and throwing in the carcasses of dead horses. Aye, we all laugh now and call that the Douglas larder, but it was clear that Sir James feared no man, and after the massacre in the church, we were sure that he feared God just as little. The first blow. The English army came north up the old road through our war-ravaged land. Thousands of them came, maybe as many as 20,000 men, led by the English King Edward II. Their baggage train, miles long, weighted down with arms and all the food and wine needed to satisfy his needs. Their vanguard arrived late in the afternoon. They were led by a young knight. He must have noticed the crown on his helmet and recognized King Robert. The knight decided to openly challenge the king and rode at him full pelt with his lance lowered. The king saw him coming and turned his horse so that the two men rode at a tremendous pace towards one another. I held my breath, and just as they were about to clash, at the last second, King Robert wrenched his horse to one side. Standing high in his stirrups, he brought his axe down on the helpless knight's head. I heard the clang of metal on metal and saw the blood and shattering of bone. The king's axe handle split in two with the force of it, and the knight fell from his horse, his helmet and head crushed by the brutal blow. I later learned that the knight was Henry de Bohun, a nobleman. Some called him brave, but I thought him foolish to think that he could defeat the Bruce. This loss mightily angered the English, and their cavalry charged at us, but despite the clamour and chaos, we could hear King Robert encouraging us as he shouted his support above the noise. "Be not dismayed because of their din, but set your spears before you, and keep all back to back with the spear points out." And despite the English numbers, I found that I was not afraid and stood firm. A deadly clash. We were well trained and stood together in schiltrons, armed with our 6-foot-long steel-tipped pikes. We also each carried an axe in our belt for close encounters. We stood tightly together, a few dozen of us, in 3 rows, each behind the other. I was at the front, and along with my comrades, we wedged our spears into the ground, knelt down, leaned them out, and held them steady in front of us. The row behind us stood upright, their lances filling the gaps between each of us on the front row, and then the third row adding even more points to the wall of skewers. We must have looked like some sort of huge hedgehog, our pikes radiating out in a formation that made it virtually impenetrable. The English still relied on their mounted men-at-arms to make a mass charge together. In that way, they would sweep across the battlefield and devastate their enemy, but we had more spearmen. So, on they came thundering in, too fast, too slow, as they saw what awaited them. Their warhorses dying as they impaled themselves on our razor-sharp pikes. Many English knights died there and then, whilst others went crashing to the ground, unable to get up, their heavy armour weighing them down. Our infantrymen came in with their axes and swords, howling their battle cries to smash the fallen to pieces as they lay helpless. The schiltrons proved to be too much for the English, and on their second attack they resorted to throwing their weapons at us from a distance in their frustration. There were spears, darts, and knives cast among us. I saw an unmounted knight come towards me, his teeth bared, snarling and spitting. He held his mace high above his head before he hurled it straight at me. For a split second I thought it might strike, but it fell at my feet with an unimpressive thud. The day was ours. We had managed to push the English back, and they were forced to flee. Day 2. That night we were able to rest in the cool of the wood, our backs and legs aching and weary from holding the heavy pikes, but we were triumphant and morale was high. We even talked about the possibility of taking the fight to the English rather than playing a defensive game. Their display that day had been pathetic, and they showed themselves to be weak and disorganized. The thick woodland sheltered us, and we were able to lay our heads down on the bracken away from the evil, wet marshland where the English had to make camp. I hoped it was alive with biting midges so that they would get no peace. We could hear the cries of the injured and smell the stench of boiling herbs and moss as they tended to their wounds. It was a short night, as there are only about 6 hours of darkness during the summer in Scotland, so the day was soon on us again. As dawn was breaking, we ate our breakfast of thin porridge and then came out from the dark of the wood, blinking into the light to face the enemy. We knew that God needed to be on our side for the win, and so we arranged ourselves into our schiltrons. Abbot Bernard of Aberoth walked among us, carrying the relics of our most beloved St. Columba. Then King Robert himself spoke to us, petitioning the power of John the Baptist, St. Andrew, and Thomas Becket, before we all knelt in prayer and were blessed by Abbot Maurice of Inchaffrey. We rose as one and began our advance on the English, who were completely unprepared, the idea being that we had to close the gap between us and them as quickly as possible. That way, the cavalry wouldn't have the time to get a clear run at our line. The schiltrons pushed forward like a hedge of marching spikes. It was midsummer's day, and even at this early hour, huddled together as we were, it was hot and I was bathed in sweat, my hands slippery on the wooden pike. The English vanguard advanced, and when we reached them, the knights were trapped, hemmed in between us Scots and the mass of their own army behind. Arrows began to rain down on us, but Sir Robert Keith rode in with his mounted cavalry, and the bowmen quickly scattered. There, in the centre of the field, we fought on and were gaining ground, skewering and hacking our way through knights, the demonic sounds of dying horses and shrieking men punctuated by the clangs and thuds of weapon on weapon and weapon on bone. Then there was a shout. "On them! On them! They flail!" was the cry, as King Robert the Bruce himself pledged his schiltron and rode in with his Gaelic warriors. There was chaos, as hundreds of the fleeing enemy, driven back to the burn, trampled on their own men now dead and dying, before they fell into the great ditch of water and were drowned in their hundreds in their desperation to escape. It was over. We had won the day, and Edward II, along with 500 knights, fled like miserable wretches for Dunbar Castle and the safety of a ship home, leaving all the others to their fate. My commander, the Black Douglas, in hot pursuit. The victory gave King Robert total control of Scotland. He immediately slighted Stirling Castle, destroying its defences to prevent the English from ever taking it again. I went on to fight with the king's brother Edward Bruce in his campaign to become the High King of Ireland, but that is another story for another day. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Please do leave a comment below if you'd like us to do more videos like this, and I'll see you next time for another video. Until then, have a great week. Cheers.